Greetings fellow humans, I'm MartianBuu, and today I have for you an early tier list for Pokemon TCG Pocket. I think it's important to emphasize the fact that it's an early tier list because at the time of this recording, global launch is still a day away, so most of the potential player base hasn't even tried the game yet. Once Pokemon Pocket is available to everyone, and especially once they add Ranked Ladder, we're going to see a lot more refinement in a lot of these archetypes that I'm going to mention, but as well as a lot of off-meta archetypes that the early access players may have been sleeping on. So by the time you see this, there's still plenty of room for you to influence the game. And I think that a lot of the off-meta things that I've tried have been okay. So if you want to tinker with whatever you shamble together with your collection or whatever interesting idea you have, I think that you're still going to be able to have a decent amount of success with it. But this will give you an idea of what people are playing, what is working out so far, but also what packs you should be opening in order to work towards specific archetypes. So if a specific archetype interests you, you'll know which packs you need to be opening to work towards getting that archetype. Something to note before we get started with the deck list, there are a lot of decks that don't have 20 good cards to run right now. I think once we get a first release, we're going to see a big shakeup as a lot of these off-meta decks and lower tier decks actually have enough good cards to play. But you're going to see a lot of these decks with potion and some of them with red card just because they need enough cards in them to play, but I don't think these cards are very good. So in all of these lists, if I felt like I could cut red card and potion, I did. I think there isn't enough draw in the game yet for low impact cards like that to be any good. So if you could draw a lot, then being able to play out red card and potion to give you a small advantage is okay because there's less pressure on each card you draw to be impactful. But since draw is so low, I tried really hard not to include those cards if I had the option. The other thing is there's only one tutor card right now, Pokeball, which gets you a random basic from your deck. So the less basics you include in your deck, the more likely the Pokeball is to find the card you want it to find, if that makes sense. So there's both this pressure to include more Pokemon because the trainers aren't quite there yet, and also pressure to include fewer Pokemon because you want your Pokeball to find specific options for you. So that's the fundamental deck list philosophy that went into all of these. And here's the tier list. So tier 1, there is a deck that I think is just more consistent, faster, and more powerful than everything else, has to run the least amount of cards it doesn't want to. Tier 2 has a base power level that's similar to tier 1, but we have type disadvantage, inconsistency, and speed that aren't quite as good as tier 1. Then tier 3 is basically everything else that's refined enough to call a meta deck. Starting from the top here, we have Pikachu EX, which I think is easily the strongest deck in the game. Pikachu is really easy to power up. It doesn't rely on any coin flips to get enough energy to attack early. It only requires 2, and it does 30 damage times the amount of lightning Pokemon on your bench. So all you need to do is get out a Pikachu, attach to it twice, and fill your bench with lightning Pokemon, and you're two-shotting everything in the game. The only downside of the Pikachu deck is having to run a bunch of extra lightning Pokemon. So we just talked about that Pokeball consistency. You can't afford to think about that with the Pikachu deck because you just need to get out extra lightning Pokemon. You're also going to see a lot of variation in the support Pokemon for Pikachu. A large part of that is because which support Pokemon you run is not very important. You mostly want to be attacking with Pikachu, and a lot of its support options are about as good as any of the other ones. So I'm going to start off here with what I think is the most popular build. We have Zapdos EX, which is going to be in all of these lists. It's another high HP, decent attacker to complement your Pikachu. One of the big negatives with it is the lightning weakness, so it's going to suffer a little bit in the mirror matches. It's nice that the Zapdos can attack for 1 lightning energy, but that attack isn't very strong. So Zapdos doesn't have a lot of high impact until you get to 3 lightning energy, which is going to do similar average damage to Pikachu EX, but a turn slower. So you typically don't like to be attacking with this if you don't have to be, but it also has only one retreat cost, so X speed allows you to get it out of the active if you had to start with it. So anyways, that's the best, most common partner for Pikachu EX. You're going to see that in all of the lists. As for what makes this build different from the others is the stage 1 lightning Pokemon that go with Pikachu. So Electrode and Zebstrika. Electrode is the best of these. So first of all, it has free retreat cost, which is really important. And for 2 lightning, it does 70 damage. So it's another fast attacker like Pikachu. You have to find the Electrode. So it's not like Zapdos where all you have to do is draw Zapdos and it's ready to go. You have to first get Voltorb and then evolve the next turn into Electrode. But if you do that, it attacks as fast as Pikachu EX does. The Zebstrika is a little lower impact, but its attack allows you to hit the bench for 30 damage, which is something not a lot of Pokemon can do right now. There isn't a good way for decks to pull a specific Pokemon off the bench right now. So if your opponent has multiple bench Pokemon out, you're not going to be able to finish off something that survived with 30 or less HP unless you're running the Zebstrika. So Zebstrika is pretty decent from that respect. We are running a 2-1 line of that so that we can fit a Giovanni in, and you really don't want to be attacking with that unless you really have to. So I think 1 is plenty. You just want to have the extra basics, so we're running 2 of the Blitzel still, but you really only want to be attacking with Zebstrika in the way late game, so you have that extra time to find your 1 copy if it is going to be relevant. Another popular build uses Lieutenant Surge, but only splashes it in. So Lieutenant Surge lets you move lightning energy from your bench to your active Electrode, Electabuzz, or Raichu. What this allows you to do is attack with Pikachu, let the Pikachu take a big hit, retreat it with X speed, and then use Lieutenant Surge to move the Pikachu's energy to an active Electrode to finish off the defending Pokemon without giving up 2 points from Pikachu. Most people who are playing Lieutenant Surge are only splashing it in this way. Sometimes you'll see them run the Raichu over the Electrode. I have Electabuzz in here because you really want to have 8 basics for this, in my opinion. It's unfortunate that it becomes harder to find Pikachu EX through Pokeball, but if you don't have a lot of basic lightning, you're not going to be able to find enough to be able to consistently deal the maximum amount of damage with Pikachu EX. Electabuzz is probably not who you want to be attacking with, but I think it's fine. It has 1 retreat cost, which is the magic number for X speed, and it attacks for 2 lightning, which is the magic number for being able to retreat Pikachu EX and then send that lightning up with Lieutenant Surge. So I think as far as a filler Pokemon, if you're going to be running Lieutenant Surge and just one thing like Electrode, Electabuzz makes a lot of sense as your 7th and 8th basic lightning. I only have 1 in this list because it's very secondary to the main strategy. You just want to have that option at some point. You don't really want to be relying on using Lieutenant Surge, and we still want to be able to fit in a Giovanni to hit certain breakpoints. Then we have my favorite build of Pikachu EX, which I think is extremely solid, and I'm surprised more people don't play it because not only does it offer a more powerful backup plan than some of these other lists, but I also think it's by far and away the most fun. So we have our Pikachu EX and Zapdos EX staples for this deck, but then we have regular Raichu, who does 3 lightning for 140, and then you have to discard all energy on it. That does so much more damage than anything else in the deck is capable of, allowing you to pull off knockouts that you otherwise couldn't have hoped to. It also really helps make those starts where you begin with Zapdos a lot more impactful. Zapdos hitting an Execute or a Mewtwo EX early with a Peck sets it up to get one shot by Raichu later. The Magneton's Volt Charge allows you to attach an energy to it for free once per turn, so you can have it soaking up energy on the bench for a while, and then you don't have to rely on retreating your currently attacking Pokemon as frequently to be able to set up a big Lieutenant Surge play. But yeah, given that the 7th and 8th lightning basic matters very little, I've found that having the Magneton to back up your Raichu adds a lot of power and consistency to this deck that it doesn't have otherwise. Then next up we have Misty Articuno EX. This deck is as fast and as strong, and sometimes faster than the Pikachu EX deck. The problem is it relies on a flip heavy card, Misty, which is a supporter that allows you to flip a coin until you get tails and attach a water energy for each heads to one of your water Pokemon. This is the only deck that can attack on the first turn. Misty is the only way to get energy onto a Pokemon on the first turn if you go first. I found that out by my opponent flipping 3 heads and powering up an Articuno EX on the first turn and knocking out my only basic Pokemon before I ever got to play. That is an extreme high roll. That is not going to happen that often, but I imagine you're going to have a lot of fun when it does. So the big issue with this one, apart from the flips, is the lightning weakness. Articuno EX and Starmie EX are the best staple attackers to go with Misty, and they are both lightning weak. So whenever you encounter the Pikachu EX deck, you're going to have a harder time than you would otherwise. But both of these attackers are comparably strong to the attackers that are used in the Pikachu EX deck. So Starmie only takes 2 water energy and it does 90 damage, much like Pikachu, but you do have to find the Starmie EX after the Staryu. It's not just all on a basic. Articuno EX has a very interesting second attack, Blizzard, so 3 for 80, and then it does 10 damage to each of your opponent's bench Pokemon, which can help hit breakpoints later on, especially if you get enough early heads with Misty. Starmie is basically the one you want to be attacking with if you fail Misty heads. Articuno EX is kind of slow if you don't get any heads on Misty, but if your opponent doesn't have the fastest start, just raw attaching to Articuno EX every turn is still pretty good. It can attack starting on 2 energy, it just doesn't do that much damage. One of the big things that I liked about playing this deck is the free retreat cost on Starmie. You can attack once or twice with the Starmie, it'll soak up enough damage, and then it's really easy to just retreat it out for whatever your next attacker is, while leaving the energy on it to be able to finish off something later to close out the game. A lot of other decks struggle to set up a second attacker, and this one I think has the easiest time setting up multiple and retreating them out to delay your opponent taking points. There are a couple other ways to build this deck that I don't think are as good. Some people force in a Greninja line. The Greninja has an ability that lets you put 20 damage on one of your opponent's Pokemon, which is really, really strong, but you either have to cut Articuno or you have to cut a lot of your secondary cards. So we're cutting Potion, which is fine, but then we have to start looking at Giovanni and Articuno EX, which are not cuts we'd like to make to fit in the 2-2-2 line of Froakie, Frogadier, Greninja. The other way is to cut the Staryu and the Starmie and just run Articuno EX, which I think isn't a great way to run the list, but the idea is you will always start with Articuno EX, so you consistently start off with a powerful attacker. And if you do hit Misties, it works out really well for you. If you do that, then you have to start including Red Card and Hand Scope, which I think are mediocre cards that are kind of good together. It's a great way to run the list if you only have 2 Articuno EX, but I do think that Starmie EX is the best attacker in the deck, so if you have those, I would run them. And in my second spot in tier 2, I have Mewtwo EX Gardevoir. This deck is slower than Pikachu and Articuno EX and a little more fragile, but it is very consistent and it deals a ton of damage. The Gardevoir is a stage 2, so it can be a little awkward to get out because there aren't any evolution tutors yet. You need to find the Ralts first, and then the Kirlia, and then the Gardevoir. So you will definitely see games where you don't find a Gardevoir until way, way, way late in the game. But the Mewtwo for 4 energy does 150 damage, which is enough to knock out almost everything in the game, with the exception of some things like Venusaur EX and Charizard EX. But having the attacker as the basic as opposed to a stage 2 means that you can start attaching energy to Mewtwo while you try to find your evolutions for Gardevoir, and sometimes that alone is enough. But yeah, Gardevoir allows you to attach a psychic energy to your active psychic Pokemon once per turn, so once you have out a Gardevoir and a Mewtwo, it doesn't matter that you have to discard 2 energy every time you use Psy Drive for 150, because you can just use your regular turn attachment and Psy Shadow to put another psychic energy on. This is probably the most linear deck among all of the meta decks. There aren't a lot of other lines to explore. You're just trying to get out of Mewtwo EX and use Psy Drive as much as possible. And if you can't do that, you lose. There are no backup plans. You're just doing that. And when you do that, there's not a lot your opponent can do to stop it. So if you like the experience of just assembling your thing and then you basically win, this is the deck for you. And if you like to adapt to situations, I would definitely try to build basically anything else, because there's only one thing this deck does. It does it very well, but I found it got stale pretty quick. And then on to tier 3. This is ordered by what I think is the most powerful to the least powerful. I didn't want to include a tier 4, which is maybe where the Golem deck should have gone, maybe even the Dragonite deck too, hard to say. I think all of these decks struggle with being slow and being less consistent than the decks in the upper tiers. So how they compare to each other matters a lot less, if that makes sense. So I think only a tier 3 was warranted. I have had fun and won a lot with all of these. So while you should probably steer for tier 2 and tier 1 if you want a competitive deck, if any of these strategies interest you, I think that they're all completely viable. So first up, we have the Moltres EX various archetypes. Moltres EX has an attack that lets you, for 1 energy, flip 3 coins, and for each heads, attach a fire energy to one of your benched Pokemon. This is one of the best sources of energy acceleration in the game. Its problem is all of its attackers have to evolve. So you have to start with Moltres EX and then find a basic to put a bunch of fire energy onto, and then you also have to find the Pokemon it evolves into to be able to actually do a bunch of damage. So given how little draw and tutor is in the game right now, that is a bit to ask. Nonetheless, when you do find all those things, it ends up being one of the most powerful archetypes in the game. First up here, we have what I think is the most popular way to build this, which is just with Charizard EX. The reason that Charizard EX makes such a good partner for Moltres is if you get it out, you win. Charizard EX has an absurd 180 health points. When this thing is active, it is going to take 2 hits or more from most of your opponent's Pokemon. And while it's doing that, it is one-shotting literally everything in the game. There is not one Pokemon in this whole game right now that Crimson Storm does not knock out in 1 hit. So you pile a bunch of energy onto your bench Charizard EX, and then when the Moltres goes down, you come up with it and sweep the rest of the game. The problem is finding the evolutions. So not only do you have to find Charmeleon, you also have to find Charizard. That can be very, very awkward. And it's not like the Mewtwo deck where if you can't find your stage 2, at least you're powering up your attacker to be able to make headway in the meantime. Moltres EX can attack. It's okay. 3 for 70 is okay. Unlike Mewtwo, where you can work towards your main goal of dealing 150. With Moltres, you're working towards your backup plan of dealing only 70, which is not great. So anyways, this deck is unstoppable when it gets going, but it has a lot of trouble getting going. It also doesn't have any use for Giovanni, so we end up running the red card filler just to get to 20 cards. You could cut Potion and red card and run a secondary attacker like Centiskorch, but then you find your Charmander less often, so it just depends on which direction you want to high roll. But Charizard is not the only partner for Moltres. You can run Articuno EX and or Centiskorch like we said. Centiskorch deals much less damage than Charizard, but it only has to discard 1 energy. Articuno EX also deals less, but it can attack for fewer energy, and it doesn't have to discard anything. It does deal 20 damage to itself when it attacks, but it keeps the energy on, so you don't have to worry about getting too many extra heads with Moltres initially. The biggest advantage of this build is that it attacks with stage 1s instead of a stage 2. Finding a stage 2 in this game is really hard right now, so being able to only have to find 1 evolution is often worth dealing a little bit less damage, especially because Centiskorch and Arcanine both hit Pikachu EX for a 1-hit knockout, and then Centiskorch and Arcanine EX, with the help of Giovanni, can one-shot Starmie. They are hitting pretty relevant numbers, they just don't sweep quite as hard as the Charizard EX does. But I think only having to evolve once to get out an attacker is a huge benefit. You also have the advantage of not running as many filler cards in here when you have 2 stage 1 lines. So we don't have to run the potion and we don't have to run the red card in here, which for me is a huge bonus. Then we have Marowak EX, which I thought was just a budget card at first, but it actually ends up being pretty decent compared to a lot of other things. The Marowak has an attack, Bone Meringue, that for 2 fighting energy, you flip 2 coins, and for each heads you deal 80. So on a stage 1 with 140 HP for 2 fighting energy, dealing an average of 80 is really good. The problem is sometimes you get 2 tails and you've wasted a whole attack step. Sometimes your opponent has a Mewtwo EX and you flip 2 heads and you win the game on the spot. So it kind of averages out that way, but having a flip-based attack can be awkward, especially if RNG tilts you. So first up here, we have Marowak and Farfetch'd. The idea with this is you want to power up a Marowak EX, and Farfetch'd is the biggest damage dealer for 1 energy in the meantime. We do have 1 regular Marowak in here, and that's just to increase our likelihood of being able to evolve Cubone. Ideally, we would always evolve into Marowak EX, but we don't have the tutors for that yet. So we're just running extra baby Marowaks to be able to do something with Cubone more often. I am running a red card in here because I feel like this deck is very low end, and having access to one red card can be handy occasionally, but you could cut that red card too and go doubles on baby Marowak to just very consistently find your Cubone evolution. The reason that doesn't tempt me too much is because I don't want to be evolving into that one too often. I really want to be evolving into the EX, so I don't want to go way too hard on consistently evolving a Cubone when half the time I'm going to be evolving into something that doesn't matter. But Marowak only gives up 1 point, and for 1 energy it deals 40. So not only does it help you consistently evolve to be able to attack with Cubone, but there are spots where you prefer to attack with this thing. I think especially as a budget build, this is a really appealing deck, and it's the deck I played the most while I was gathering packs. So if you want to follow the Martian track through Pokemon Pocket, this is step 1. Here's another list that runs Sandslash, so you get to cut all of the filler cards and just run a whole extra line. You don't have to run baby Marowaks because you have the extra line of things to find. So if you find Sandslash, you're attacking with Sandslash. If you find Marowak, you're attacking with Marowak, and they're both really good to power up while the other one is attacking. 2 for 70. Sandslash is pretty bad when you compare it to Electrode, since it's all the same thing except it has 2 more retreat cost, but the fighting type is pretty good against Pikachu EX, and you are going to be encountering that deck a lot. So running a fighting type deck as a response to that is pretty decent. Sandslash has low HP for the energy investment, which is why I don't prefer this build over the other one. I do think the most games you're going to win are going to be the games where you find a Marowak EX early and attack with specifically that Pokemon. But having a backup plan is good, and Sandslash is pretty decent, especially for budget reasons. Then next up we have Venusaur EX, which is a ridiculously beefy Pokemon that heals itself for way too much. The problem is it's a little awkward to evolve and get going. There is a popular version of this deck with a Lilligant. It has 2 grass for 50 and attach a grass energy to one of your bench Pokemon. I don't like that version because you have to attack with the Lilligant twice to break even on your energy investment. You really want to be attaching to your Venusaur EX on the bench to get it powered up and ready to go, because once that thing is active and swinging with Giant Bloom, that's when you win the game. But if you attach an energy to the Lilligant and it gets knocked out before it even gets to swing, you've lost energy that way. And if it only attacks once, you've invested a ton of cards and energy into a Pokemon that's only put 1 energy onto your Venusaur, so it ends up being very clunky and fragile. Better partner, in my opinion, is Exeggutor EX. So it's a stage 1 that also has an absurd amount of health on it. It has 160 HP. It attacks for 1 energy. So you get out your Exeggutor EX, attach 1 energy to it, and then you're free to put all of your other energy into your Bulbasaur, Ivysaur, Venusaur EX. It also being a tanky grass Pokemon means that you have another target for your Erica. So Erica heals one of your grass Pokemon for 50 health, which is a big reason why these decks are so good. It can make it really awkward for your opponent to knock these guys out. One of the big problems I had with this deck is you want to put your opponent in a position to where they have to take 4 points. So you don't want to bench too many things, because when your opponent's knocked out an Exeggutor EX and you send up your Venusaur, if you have another Execute or Bulbasaur on the bench, your opponent can just Sabrina around it to take their 3rd point. But if you don't bench them, then while you're powering up your Bulbasaur, your Ivysaur, your opponent can Sabrina and knock it out before it ever gets to become Venusaur EX and have all that health. So I think one of the biggest weaknesses this deck has is Sabrina. If decks couldn't as reliably bring up your singular Pokemon on the bench, it would be a bit better. But because you're both supposed to bench more and not supposed to bench anything, it's just really awkward to work around. Another problem I had with this deck is Bulbasaur requires 2 energy, Ivysaur requires 3 energy. So you can't evolve and attack with this on curve. So imagine you start going second with Bulbasaur, you attach 1 energy to it, it can't attack. Then you evolve to Ivysaur and attach energy, it can't attack. Only then when you evolve into Venusaur, can you attach energy and hit with your basic Razor Leaf attack. So you missed out on 2 turns of attacking just because if the Bulbasaur had 1 for 20 and the Ivysaur had 2 for 40, you'd have dealt 60 damage in that time. That's not the ideal line that you want to go for with this deck, but the fact that every time you start Bulbasaur, you're going to be evolving late or skipping damage, that does matter because you are going to be in those situations sometimes. So anyways, this deck is a little bit clunky, but when everything works out for you, it feels really unstoppable. Venusaur EX having 190 HP and healing itself for 30 every time it attacks is ridiculous. When I played this deck initially, I had potions in the Sabrina spot, but since then I've really lost a lot of faith in Potion. Potion is incredibly low impact for a card, so I try not to run it when I don't have to. And a friend pointed out to me that they were running Sabrinas over Potions, and it clicked. I was like, just because this is a healing deck doesn't mean it needs to run a bad healing card. So I think you do value the Sabrina both as a stall card and as a way to take better knockouts to finish off the game over Potion, which is only occasionally useful. Then we have one of the most fun decks in the game, Dragonite. So this is one of the premier non-EX attackers in the game. And now that I'm thinking about it, I forgot to mention during the Mewtwo segment that the reason you have to run Giovanni and Mewtwo is specifically so that its side drive can one-shot Dragonite, because this deck is pretty strong and really fun, and so it's really popular, even if it's not as good as some of the other ones. So Dragonite's Draco Meteor, for 1 water, 1 lightning, and 2 colorless, deals 50 damage to your opponent's Pokemon 4 different times. You have no control over what gets hit with each 50, and if opponent has, say, a Pokemon with 10 HP left on the field, there's a chance that all 200 will hit that one Pokemon. So basically Draco Meteor is a bit of a gamble, but you can hit multiple things for a lot of damage, and 4 for 200, as we learned from Charizard, is a really good deal. This doesn't even make you discard the energy. Once you start attacking with Dragonite, you can keep doing it. I would say it has 160 HP and only gives up 1 point, but that's not really an advantage because of how much of a pain it is to get a Dragonite going. Even if you wouldn't lose when your Dragonite gets knocked out by points, you've probably lost by tempo. There's no chance you're getting out a second one. But it has 160 health, which is a lot, and because it does so much damage, there's a really good chance that you're going to be able to get this out, attack twice, and end the game. One of the more popular builds is with Weezing. So you're going to turn Dark off in the deck building stage so that you never get a Dark energy for your Weezing. It's already a little bit scuffed to find a Lightning and a Water. I have lost games where the only reason I lost is because I never found the other type. You don't want to add Dark in there to make it even harder to find both a Lightning and a Water. But what's good about the Weezing is it deals damage without having to put any energy on it at all. You can just use its gas leak ability to poison the defending Pokemon and have it sit there taking damage while Weezing, with its respectable 110 HP, soaks hits. Things like Articuno and Pikachu only deal 80 or 90 damage, so Weezing can afford to take one of those hits, and then you can return it to your hand with Koga, or you can just let it die and send up another one. You're going to see a lot of people playing it this way, but I do think there's another way that is probably more fun and I think better. So this build runs the baby Articuno, which has almost as much health as Weezing, but you can run Misty in the deck to potentially attack with it. Its primary function is just to be 100 health on a basic. You don't have to find Weezing before this is a pretty decent early tank. It also has only 1 retreat cost, so it works better with X speed. But if you play Misty on it and get 2 or 3 heads, you can attack with Ice Beam and both get in a bunch of chip damage, as well as half the time you're going to paralyze the defending Pokemon, slowing down your opponent and giving you more turns to attach to Dragonite. So even if you get tails on your first flip with Misty, Articuno is already being a decent early tank that only gives up 1 point. And if you high roll enough with Misty, you get to set up the field for Dragonite to finish it off, as well as slow your opponent down with paralysis. There is a similar version, and probably the most popular version on ladder, that runs Frostmoth instead of Articuno. The benefits are very similar. It's a Pokemon that can be powered up by Misty and offers disruption, but this time in the form of sleep rather than paralysis. The reason I don't like this one as much is Frostmoth A has less HP, but also it's a stage 1. Articuno can have a lot of benefit just being a basic Pokemon, whereas Frostmoth, you need to power it up before it's any good. So basically, if you were going to go the Misty route, I would recommend the Baby Articuno over the Frostmoth. And then the final spot on the tier list is Golem. What you do with this deck is you actually turn the fighting energy off in the deck building stage. So your energy zone will only produce darkness energy. That means your Weezing is guaranteed to be able to attack. Weezing feels a lot better as a defensive stall chip Pokemon in this build because you actually get to run the darkness energy. You can use its 1 for 30 attack. And then the Golem requires 3 colorless energy and 1 fighting for its big attack. So while the Weezing is out there chipping away, you can use that dark energy to start getting double edge ready, and when it comes time for Golem to attack, you use Brock to get that fighting energy requirement. So Brock lets you attach a fighting energy to an Onix or a Golem. You can use Brock the same turn you attach an energy, so you have to do 2 raw darkness attachments to the Golem, but on that 3rd turn, you attach from the energy zone and use Brock, and you're ready to go with double edge. 150, as we learned from Mewtwo EX, is a really good number. It knocks out most things in the game. Once you get your Golem online, you're going to sweep through a lot of decks. And Weezing being able to attack and poison for 1 energy is going to take a lot of pressure off the Golem once you finally get that out. Of all the decks on this list, this is the least meta, but I do think it's underplayed. I think it's similarly powerful to the Dragonite deck. The one thing that I think is a big negative with this deck is the Geodude having 2 retreat cost. If that thing had 1 retreat cost, I think maybe it would be a little bit more popular. Or if Brock could attach to Geodude and Graveler, like you have to wait until it's a Golem before you can use Brock. That's where this deck gets a little bit awkward, but it's a big stage 2 deck that once it starts attacking kind of ends the game. That requires a little bit of time and you to run a stall tanky support mon. So very similar to Dragonite in that way. So that was my early tier list for Pokemon Pocket. I hope it gave you some ideas of maybe some stuff to build for. As you saw on the screen there, it would show you what packs each of those cards came out of. So you can start working towards something that interests you with that information. I'm going to have links for all of these decks in the description. I have also played some version of all of these on stream and made a YouTube video of it. So if any of these interest you, please explore the rest of my channel. You will likely find that deck has a video accompanying it. Along those lines, if you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll like, subscribe, comment, share with a friend. I hope you'll enjoy playing Pokemon Pocket, and thank you so much for watching.